If you like war horror movies, you're in for a treat. Today I found another intense film for you. The strongest modern mercenaries versus an invincible Nazi zombie army. From the UK, the 2008 film Outpost. The story takes place in Eastern Europe, in a dangerous zone plagued by civil war. A mercenary captain, DC, accepts a special protection mission from a man claiming to be a geological engineer. The objective is to travel to that dangerous zone. Apparently, the engineer's client, in this region, has purchased a piece of mineral-rich land and sent him to survey it. The mercenary's mission is to protect him. DC's team consists of 7 men, for a fee of $10,000 each. They take the job without hesitation. However, they never could have imagined that this seemingly ordinary and simple protection mission would ultimately turn into a bloody massacre. As they neared their destination, they had to cross a forest on foot. But not long into their walk, their headsets are suddenly hit with some kind of interference, emitting a piercing static noise. DC immediately asks the comms officer for the cause, but the officer can't explain it either, guessing it's just old equipment malfunctioning. Since it didn't affect normal communication, no one paid it much mind. They continued towards the mission location. Soon, they arrived at their destination. A strange building in a clearing came into view. As they cautiously approached, they realized it was an abandoned military bunker. This instantly made DC suspicious of the engineer's true purpose here. However, their job was just to protect the engineer. His business was none of theirs. So, DC didn't ask too many questions. He then assigned 2 men to stand guard outside, while the rest entered with the engineer. But just as they split up to explore the bunker, as instructed by the engineer, the soldiers outside suddenly spotted a flash of reflected light in the woods. Thinking it was an enemy attack, the 2 opened fire at the light source without hesitation. Hearing the gunshots, the others rushed out of the bunker to provide support, but they didn't see any sign of an enemy. As DC was asking the 2 what happened, the headsets were hit with interference again. Just as the comms officer was about to turn off the equipment, a bullet hit him in the shoulder. His teammates quickly provided cover, but they still couldn't see the enemy. They could only fire blindly. So DC quickly ordered them to cease fire. They needed to at least confirm the enemy's position first. Meanwhile, the medic quickly treated the comms officer's wound. Unexpectedly, after they stopped firing, the woods fell completely silent. It was as if no one was there at all. But one of the soldiers insisted that he had hit one of the enemies. If that was the case, DC had him go over and confirm it, while also checking if there were any other enemies nearby. With the others providing cover, the soldier charged into the woods. Not long after, he returned safely, but with some strange news. It's nothing. No bodies, no blood. Not even shell casings. That's strange. The comms officer was clearly hit by an enemy bullet. Feeling more and more that something was wrong, DC immediately found the engineer and told him to finish his business and leave quickly. Because this place was in an open field, surrounded by woods, it was a difficult place to defend. If the enemy attacked again, they would have a hard time holding their position. DC still had 2 men stand guard outside, while the others entered the bunker to continue exploring with the engineer. The first priority was to find the generator. At first, DC didn't want to know what the engineer was doing here, but now the situation had changed. His man was injured, so the engineer's business became his business. He wanted the engineer to tell him the truth. The engineer confessed that he wasn't here for geological survey, but to find something. But he didn't specify what it was. Meanwhile, as 2 of the men explored deeper into the bunker, they saw a cross in a corner. The 2 were a bit spooked, because under normal circumstances, a military bunker shouldn't have something like that. At this point, DC and the engineer finally found the generator. But because the equipment was old and hadn't been used for a long time, the engineer didn't know if it could be started. And while the 2 were inspecting the generator, another soldier made a shocking discovery. In a very hidden small room, the walls were covered in bloody handprints. When the flashlight slowly panned behind them, the 2 were horrified to find that the room was filled with dead bodies. If it weren't for their hardened mercenary mentality, they probably would have wet themselves on the spot. The bodies looked quite fresh. Even more incredibly, there was a survivor among the pile of bodies. After the others arrived, they carried the survivor out. At the same time, the engineer successfully fixed the generator. The pitch-black bunker was instantly illuminated. Under the light, one of the soldiers discovered something incredible. A Nazi flag hanging on the wall. It turned out this military bunker was a remnant from the Nazi era of World War II. Before they could process this, the priority was to figure out the survivor's identity. But no matter how they questioned him, the man didn't say a word. He didn't even show a single expression on his face. He looked as if he were brain dead. With no other choice, they gave up questioning him. DC then pulled the engineer aside and asked if this man had anything to do with him. After all, this was his mission location. But the engineer immediately denied it. Since they couldn't confirm the survivor's identity, DC could only assign the comms officer to guard him. The series of unexpected events had also seriously delayed their progress. They had planned to finish the mission and return before dark, but now it looked like they would have to spend the night here. So DC had to send men out to set up traps to prevent any surprise attacks at night. The engineer, meanwhile, was alone in a room, searching for something. He opened a key box, took a key from inside, and then, following the bunker's blueprint, stealthily opened a steel door. The engineer turned on the light, and a strange machine came into view. He excitedly took out a photo to compare. And sure enough, it was identical to the object in it. It seemed this machine was the purpose of his trip. He then took out a communication device and secretly reported this to his client. The object has been found. Take all necessary measures. At this moment, the comms officer, standing by the survivor, encountered something strange. A coin in his hand accidentally fell to the ground. In the instant he bent down to pick it up, he saw next to the survivor, 2 pairs of wet feet had appeared. After confirming it wasn't his eyes playing tricks on him, the comms officer quickly grabbed his weapon, ready to fire. But when he looked up, there was nothing next to the survivor. DC, who had just arrived, saw this. But because the incident was so bizarre, the comms officer chose not to say anything, merely saying he was practicing his firing stance. Meanwhile, the engineer, who was scanning the machine, also encountered something inexplicable. He was concentrating on operating the computer and didn't notice that behind him, a terrifying figure in a Nazi uniform had appeared out of thin air. Then, the computer mysteriously malfunctioned, and a strange sound came from behind him. The engineer turned around, and the figure was gone. But strangely, even though no one was outside, the door had mysteriously locked from the outside. At that moment, the Nazi soldier reappeared behind him. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door again. It was DC. Seeing that he could no longer hide it, the engineer had to confess to DC. This machine was what they were looking for. But DC still didn't understand what this piece of scrap metal was for. But the engineer called it a miracle of physics. Einstein once proposed a bold theory called the unified field theory. Simply put, it's the unification of the 4 fundamental forces of nature: gravity, electromagnetism, the strong force, and the weak force. If this research were successful, it would be the greatest breakthrough in human scientific history. The energy produced would not only solve humanity's energy crisis, but would also advance Earth's technology to a new level. It is said that Einstein dedicated the latter half of his life to this research. But just as he was about to find the answer, he immediately stopped the experiments and destroyed all his research data. But after that, the Nazis secretly began this research. And this machine here was what they used to manipulate the unified field. The room upstairs was where the bodies were found. Therefore, the engineer speculates that the Nazis wanted to use bodies to control the machines, generated energy. In other words, they wanted to inject the energy into human bodies to create a powerful army and thereby win the war. DC found this hard to believe. But if what the engineer said was true, then the value of this machine would be immeasurable. However, at this moment, no one knew. A terrible thing was about to happen. First, one of the soldiers heard a noise from the room full of corpses. When he went in to check, he clearly felt an unclean presence behind him. Terrified, he quickly ran out. Then, the bunker speakers inexplicably started playing music. The comms officer couldn't turn it off, no matter what. He finally had to pull the plug, and only then did the music stop. But the horror was far from over. With a deafening roar that tore through the night sky, the dark woods were suddenly illuminated, revealing countless eerie silhouettes. Seeing the enemy approaching, everyone immediately opened fire. DC also rushed out with his men to provide support. This time was different from the daytime. They could clearly see the enemy. But strangely, the other side didn't fire back. They were just standing there. Yet the mercenaries' bullets couldn't hit them. Even more bizarre, after a gust of cold wind, the enemy vanished without a trace, and one of the team members disappeared with them. But none of the traps they set had been triggered. How did the enemy walk over and take him? Could it be that the team member just ran over himself? It wasn't until DC found a Nazi medal on the ground that he realized the soldier had truly been captured. But DC had no time to consider how they had done it. He was more concerned about this medal from the World War II Nazi era, and this reminded the medic that the bullet that hit the comms officer during the day was also from the World War II era. Could their enemy be a unit of Nazi soldiers that no longer exists? DC immediately took the bullet and the medal to the engineer, asking him what was going on. The engineer, surprised, played a tape he had found in the bunker. On it, the entire process of the Nazi experiment with the machine was recorded. Just as the engineer had guessed, they really did infuse the energy produced by the machine into the soldiers' bodies to enhance their combat capabilities. Theoretically, this is entirely achievable. By intertwining the machine's energy with the human magnetic field, they can appear and disappear at will. Because such a soldier is essentially a form of energy, they can become solid or vanish into thin air. They are even immune to all physical damage. Bullets can't harm them at all. This explains why they couldn't hit the enemy earlier, and how a team member was taken away so silently. It seems the Nazis really succeeded. The enemies outside are the super soldiers they created. However, because the technology was not yet mature, the energy provided by the machine was limited, preventing them from operating at a long range, which led to them being permanently trapped in the bunker. And because DC's team intruded, they disturbed the magnetic field here. So the Nazi soldiers appeared again. Seeing that DC was still confused, the engineer had to explain it to him another way. All existence is nothing more than vibration. For years, those who believe have claimed that Apparitions are merely ripples in electromagnetic fields. Now DC finally understood. Their opponents were a group of ghosts that were impossible to defeat. He prepared to pack up and run immediately. But the engineer advised DC not to do anything foolish and handed him a file. DC opened it and found it contained information about his family. To ensure they could take the machine, they had threatened the lives of all the mercenaries' families. At this moment, although DC was furious, there was nothing he could do. The engineer said that his client had already sent reinforcements. They just had to hold out until their arrival to leave. No sooner had he spoken than a miserable scream came from outside. It was the recently captured team member, being tortured by the Nazi soldiers. They plunged bayonets into the soldier's body until he slowly died in agony. Against these invulnerable Nazi soldiers, they were completely helpless. They could only watch the scene unfold, and their defenses against such an opponent were completely useless, because the Nazi soldiers could appear anywhere without a sound or a trace. One team member was just organizing his gear when a Nazi soldier grabbed him from behind. His fate was predictable. Logically speaking, if the Nazi soldiers wanted to, they could wipe out this mercenary squad in minutes. But they seemed to enjoy the thrill of killing their prey one by one, letting them die in fear and despair. The next morning, they were horrified to find the bodies of their two murdered teammates, posed in a strange way, inside their camp. An atmosphere of fear enveloped everyone. There was no way they could last until reinforcements arrived. To prevent his entire team from being wiped out, DC couldn't care about anything else. He ordered his man to forcibly take the engineer. But the engineer said it was already too late to leave, because the Nazi soldiers would never let them go. The soldier didn't care about that. It's better than just waiting here to die. Just as he was about to forcibly take the engineer, a Nazi soldier appeared out of thin air behind him. Whoa. The engineer fired a full clip, which obviously had no effect. DC and the others came running at the sound. But after the lights in the room flickered, the soldier vanished in an instant. Losing another teammate also made everyone realize that they could never escape. Could they only wait to die? If they couldn't escape, then they had to find a way to kill them. To find a method, the engineer played the Nazi videotape again. As a result, he saw a familiar face in the footage. Unexpectedly, the bald man they had rescued was actually a Nazi officer. One of the mercenaries couldn't stand it anymore. He walked right over and put a bullet in the officer's head. Well, that worked. So we can kill them, right? Just when they thought they had successfully killed the officer, to their great surprise, he came back to life. The mercenary was about to finish him off, but the bunker's lights suddenly went out. When they came back on, the bald man was gone, and he had taken the comms officer with him. When they followed the screams outside, they only found the comms officer's body. From the initial 8-man squad, only half remained. No one knew if they would be next. Just as everyone was despairing, the engineers suddenly thought of a way to fight them. Since this machine can provide energy to the Nazi soldiers, it can also control them. Otherwise, if such powerful ghost soldiers went out of control, they would pose a threat to the Nazis themselves. So he decided to restart the machine to see if it would work. But to be on the safe side, they had to find a way to lure the Nazi soldiers as close to the machine's range as possible. The closer the better. There was no other way. They had to take the risk. The engineers stayed to start the machine. DC and the other two acted as bait to attract the Nazi soldiers. To ensure the plan was foolproof, the three prepared enough guns and ammunition and set up even more landmines and traps around the perimeter. The engineer was also preparing to start the machine. With everything ready, night soon fell, and the Nazi soldiers, with the same entrance, arrived on schedule, led by the bald officer. Facing this army of immortal ghost soldiers, the three mercenaries showed no fear. But with the officer's command, the Nazi soldiers launched an attack. Seeing this, DC chose not to open fire, but to wait for them to trigger the landmines. As expected, the landmines couldn't harm them, with the enemy almost upon them. DC quickly gave the order to fire. The bullets were useless, but they could draw their attention. The three fired, while retreating towards the bunker. Unexpectedly, the soldiers followed them, but they were still some distance from their destination, so they had to continue firing in coordination, slowly luring the Nazi soldiers forward step by step. Pull back. But then, the unexpected happened. One of the mercenaries fired a few extra shots and was ambushed by a Nazi soldier from the side and was captured on the spot. But this mercenary was a tough one. With his mortal body, he fought them head-on for a few rounds until he was finally stabbed full of holes. His sacrifice greatly slowed the advance of the Nazi soldiers. and allowed the remaining two to successfully lure them near the machine. At the same time, the engineer was ready. He decisively seized the moment and activated the machine. The next second, a huge surge of energy erupted outwards. The moment the Nazi soldiers were engulfed, they immediately stopped moving and fell to the ground. The engineer's theory was proven correct, but before they could celebrate, the machine suddenly malfunctioned and stopped running. Without the machine's suppression, the Nazi soldiers began to stir again. The two could only buy time for the engineer to see if he could restart the machine. But they didn't last long. The medic was the first to fall. DC was also ambushed and suffered a serious leg injury. He struggled back to the room, only to hear from the engineer the desperate news that the machine couldn't be restarted. Now the engineer was thinking only of escape. He found that the ventilation duct in the room led outside. But DC's leg was severely injured. Even standing was a struggle, let alone climbing into a ventilation duct. Knowing he couldn't leave, DC chose to stay behind. He resolutely opened the steel door and began a final showdown with the Nazi soldiers outside. The engineer, meanwhile, took the opportunity to climb into the ventilation duct. Not long after, DC's screams echoed throughout the bunker. The engineer finally managed to crawl out of the duct, but when he opened the door, he was horrified to find that the bald officer had been waiting for him outside all along. In the end, he didn't make it out alive either. Thus, the 8-man squad was completely wiped out. But the story was just beginning. Because not long after, the reinforcement squad finally arrived. They too found the bodies in the bunker, as well as the Nazi officer pretending to be a survivor. Clearly, the same tragedy was about to befall them. Alright, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.